Today we are joined by Nathan Canestaro. Nathan is a professional intelligence officer and author of the newly released book, The Mighty Moo, the USS Cowpens and her epic journey from Jinx ship to the Navy's first carrier into Tokyo Bay, which will be linked in the description below. It tells the underdog story of how a scrappy World War II aircraft carrier with an untested crew defied the odds and earned 12 battle stars in the Pacific Theater. Enjoy the episode. So, looking at this book, this story, it has a direct connection to your grandfather. Your grandfather served on the USS Cowpens during World War II in the Pacific Theater. But when it comes to this story, how did you discover this story as a whole beyond your grandfather and decide to write a book on it?
So, I mean, the simplest answer is to describe this book as a failed genealogy project. I was interested in my grandfather's military service, and I started digging, trying to find out. He wouldn't talk about it. I mean, he's a lot like many other men of his generation. It was a traumatic time for him. And after he died, I said, okay, well, I research military conflict and international relations for history. Let me see what I can find out on my own. And I have to say that I kind of failed at that, at the very least didn't get what I hoped to. I mean, I confirmed he was there. I have a little bit of a paper trail to when he arrived and when he left. He appears in photos and things like that. But the thing is, the Navy focuses its record keeping on its officers, and pilots in particular. And my grandfather was a tail gunner. He was an enlisted man. And usually the enlisted don't show up in the official record for the Navy unless they do something heroic or they get killed. So I know he was there and, have a sort of a general sense of the events that were swirling around him. But as I was looking for my grandfather, I found the story of the ship and the people around him. And I guess the mission, there was a little bit of mission creep. I started trying to research about my grandfather, and then I'm like, okay, well, I can't, essentially completely retrace his steps. So what if I try and figure out what was going on around him, and sort of indirectly try and live, sort of make that connection in my head in terms of what it must have been like. And at some point, I was about a year or two into that effort, the light bulb just kind of came on. And I said to my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, I said, I think there's a book here, because there's some absolutely tremendous stories, and the tale of the Cowpens is not one that's really been widely known. I think I get asked one question more than any others, like, why have I never heard of the USS Cowpens? It's kind of an overlooked story. And Sarah, my wife, she didn't know any more than I did what writing a book involved. And she's like, oh yeah, you should totally do it. Like I just said, hey, let's go out for dinner. This, and I think if I had known what that all involved at the time, perhaps I would have thought twice about it. But it sort of set me on this journey, and it took 10 years from sort of the moment the light bulb came on and said, hey, there's a story here, to the moment that it hit the shelves, in your local bookstore. It was a decade.
Yeah, it's sort of a very fitting name. You mentioned how there wasn't a lot of literature written about it or a lot of history told about it. And it's named after a revolutionary battle, the Battle of Cowpens, which doesn't get a lot of attention when you look back at the Revolutionary War. I actually have a whole podcast episode about the Southern Theater of the Revolutionary War, so everyone can go check that out if they want to learn more about Cowpens. But it was a very pivotal battle in the Revolutionary War in the Southern Theater that directly led to Yorktown. And when looking at this aircraft carrier, it's the same thing. It was a very pivotal ship in the Pacific Theater that was there for a lot of the action. And you're right, it doesn't really get a lot of buzz. But I do want to linger on the relationship with your grandfather. My grandfather on my dad's side served in the military. I'm too young for him to be in World War II. He just served in the military, in the Air Force. He was a cop, and he passed away when I was 12. And it's one of, I can't regret it because I can't control it, but I wish I got to know him better, and him being around as I was older and able to appreciate and be more interested in, the history and sort of his life. But what was your relationship like with your grandfather? You mentioned he was more reserved. The war was kind of a traumatic talking point for him. So, how difficult was it to get information out of him as you were trying to learn his story?
Virtually impossible. Grandpa did not, want to talk about it. And you know, as he got older and was approaching the end of his life, I made more of an effort to try and get it out of him. And those times that I brought it up, it brought him to tears, and I felt rotten, that I caused trauma to my grandfather, and to make, I didn't really learn anything out of it anyway. So those few times that he told stories, they always focused on the lighthearted, the funny moments, the things that he could, he fondly recalled. I served overseas in the Middle East during the War on Terror, and when I came, I was over there for 7, 8 months and came home, and I was in the desert for all this time, and I just wanted to surround myself with water. So I went scuba diving in the South Pacific and visited a number of the islands that my grandfather's squadron had bombed. And afterwards, I went, sort of talked to him about it, and he couldn't get it. He's like, why would you go to these places? Here they are. You paid a lot of money to get there. They're on the edge of the world, and he sort of, I'm, that wartime association was still there. And I told him, I said, I went to war and I missed the water. And he got this wistful look in his eye, and he goes, that's funny, because I went to war and I missed the land. He had the exact opposite opinion, sort of view of it. But he told a story about a chicken farm, actually, where you have to remember, a lot of these guys, they go through training. They're 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. They're hell raisers. They're troublemakers. If you and they're looking for ways to entertain themselves. And Grandpa told a story. We were at an air show in Ohio, and one of the planes that he had trained in was kind of doing the circuit and flying around, and that kind of jarred loose this memory. And he and his pilot essentially found a free-range chicken farm, with a few 100,000 chickens on it, and then dove on it like a practice dive bombing run. And about halfway down, the pilot changed the pitch on the propeller, so the plane made this terrible noise. And he said, if you've never seen a few 100,000 chickens take to the air simultaneously, he says it's something you'll never forget. So, those are the sorts of things that Grandpa would tell you, but that doesn't really leave you, much about the war. It's just kind of the highlights, the things that he found humor in.
That's an interesting perspective he has on that Pacific theater after his experience. It's sort of like when you eat bad food, you eat something that you love your entire life, and then you eat it once and you get really sick, and then every time you look at that food after, it's like you can't even look at it, and it makes you sick to your stomach. It's sort of, that trauma connects directly. But I do want to get a little more into the research process. You mentioned earlier that it took you 10 years to write this book. I think I heard you say somewhere else that you were interviewing other families who had ancestors who served on the Cowpens. What was that process like?
So, they, let me put it this way: the best, if you're dealing with a huge pile of information, the best way to start is put some structure behind it. Okay, and for me, the backbone of the book was the Navy records. So, the Navy was a very good record keeper. You can go to the National Archives, which is about a half an hour from my house, and find the day-to-day goings, the deck logs, what they did every single day, location, dawn, noon, dusk, what they did, missions flown. Okay, so that was what the ship did. And then they would have specific reports for every major operation and talk about, the plan and sort of a summary of the operation. And then in addition to that, the squadrons had their own situation reports, and also filed reports of every single dogfight or bombing mission they were ever in. So it was an embarrassment of riches. It was about 3,000 to 5,000 pages of government records that you sort through. So I came up with a timeline, essentially. A lot of this stuff got cut, when I was transitioning from an outline to a text, but it sort of gave me a structure of what the ship was doing on a day-to-day basis. And then on top of that, I put the personal accounts, because the government records can be pretty sterile. They're kind of clinical, with a few exceptions, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit. But if then you put, the diaries, for example, or Bob Price's letters, a lot of personal documents that families had given me. You put that on top of it, it adds sort of human flavor to something which generally would have been just by itself would have been very, very dry. And the other thing that I think the outline worked, really helped to do, was that oftentimes, because if you were a guy on the Cowpens and you're writing home like Bob Price was, uh, there was a censor. Okay, and the letters had to go through to censor to make sure that it did not reveal any classified information. So sometimes they were very coy, or they just kind of alluded to things without any details. And I'm sorry, I mentioned his name several times. Bob Price was one of the major figures in the book, and he started as the commander of the fighter squadron, and then went on to command its air group, and so on. So sort of a big voice in the book. And there was one series of letters that he wrote home, and he was talking about an operation that had gone bad and they'd lost several men. And he didn't say that specifically, but he made an allusion to, you know, time passes and familiar faces fall by the wayside, and that's hard, but it's something that we're just going to have to get accustomed to. And if I didn't put that on sort of the chronology to know that he wrote that letter like a week after they got back from this operation, it would have made no sense. But when you put the two of them side by side, sort of the official Navy records, and then Bob making a comment about it, you're like, oh, that's what he's talking about. So, like any first time author, I wrote too much. And then it was just sort of the process of compacting it down into something that flowed well, and sort of was a, cut out all the fat as it was. But there was on one hand, I had too much information, and on the other hand, not enough. The Navy records were enormous and just a huge volume. There were a few key people that I would have loved to have gotten their perspective on, and I think only in one, either they had passed and they left no record, or alternatively, there was one instance in which I had a family actually refuse to deal with me. They're like, nope, we're not interested. We don't want to. We don't want to talk, which is too bad, because you would have been an essential voice in the book. But perhaps my only regret in writing the book is I started too late. Maybe I should have started 10 years earlier, and I could have talked to more of these guys in person. As of today, mid 2024, I know of only one Cowpens veteran that's still alive, and most of the gentlemen that I talked to, I probably talked to about 12 or 15. They've all passed just in the intervening couple of years, which is really very sad. But it's an inevitability. They were in their 90s when I found them.
It is sad. But that is something I would like to commend you on in the book that made it much more intriguing. It has a human blanket over it. It's riddled with notes from the ship's history and journal entries from the guys aboard the ship that really give you that firsthand perspective. And that's one of the main aspects of the narrative that makes it really intriguing, at least to me. Um, I would I would like to get into the history of it now, the meat and potatoes of the book, starting at the beginning of the war before the Cowpens was uh, materialized. What was the state of the U.S. Navy in the early years of the war? Because following Pearl Harbor was a huge blow to our Navy. We didn't have, a world dominant, powerful Navy like we do today. So, can you walk me through sort of the state of our Navy post Pearl Harbor in the early days of the war?
It was bad. It wasn't good. By the way, I just finished listening to your podcast with John Bruning, who I think covers a little bit of that same period. That was a great interview. Perhaps the best way to put it is the Navy was unprepared to fight this war, and they knew it was coming, and had actually started the shipbuilding process to build the carriers they needed to fight the war. By the time, essentially summer of 1940, the fall of France. But ships take a while to build, and so when war did come, they didn't have nearly as many as they needed. They wanted to fight the war. And then to make matters worse, I think we all forget like how bad things were that first year, 1942. From Pearl Harbor to probably mid 19. Well, okay, so let's say just in 1942. There were 6 aircraft carriers operating in the Pacific, and 4 of them were lost in combat. Now, you and I are sort of scholars of modern politics. Can you imagine the political firestorm if this country went to war and lost 2/3 of its carriers in the first year. I mean, absolutely, that just blows my mind. Now, there was two victories in there. There was Coral Sea and Midway, and that sort of restored the two sides to parity, but it was really, really costly. So, how the story of the Cowpens gets started on this is largely due to President Roosevelt. And, you know, President Roosevelt was very, very familiar with the Navy. He had served for 8 years as the #2 man in the Navy during World War One. And that was longest he'd been in any other job besides the presidency himself. So he was intimately familiar with the Navy and how it operated. He knew all the characters, all the major personalities firsthand. He joked he was his own Secretary of the Navy. I mean, he was constantly in their business, doing things that a normal president, without that experience, just never would be bothered to do.
Yeah, and the other bureaucrats were kind of annoyed by that, weren't they?
Yeah, they really were. I mean, the Navy didn't like the president messing with their business. And what is, again, scholar of modern history, it's amazing to me that the president can go to the Navy and say, "Hey, I want you to do this." And the Navy's like, "Yeah, we're not going to do that." FDR described his fights with the admirals as like punching a feather bed. He said, you start slugging at a feather bed and you punch and you punch and you punch until you're exhausted, and then you stop, and the feather bed's pretty much the same way it was when you started. And he lost more bureaucratic battles than he won. But one story, and this is how we get into the Cowpens, was FDR was really concerned that they didn't have enough carriers to fight the war. And they had a new class of carriers that were being constructed called the Essex class. And there's a few of them still left. There's one in New York City. There's a couple, there's one in South Carolina. I think there's one in Alabama that you can go and visit and see. When you think World War II carriers, that's an Essex. That's kind of the image in your head. Great, great ships, fast, 100 aircraft, resilient to battle damage, but slow to build. And there were a number of them under construction. And FDR was like, we just don't have enough of these. And we can't build them fast enough. So he went to the Navy, and his idea was, hey, we paid for several dozen of these Cleveland class light cruisers, which are kind of a middleweight ship, 5 and 6 inch guns. Why don't we just turn them into aircraft carriers? They're already under construction. It's not like we're starting from scratch. We've already paid for them. Let's just convert them into aircraft carriers. And the Navy is like, no, we're not going to do that. They denied the president's order. And so he went back to them a second time. They gave a number of reasons why they shouldn't do it. They were too small. It'd be dangerous to fly from. They wouldn't be ready much faster than the Essexes, blah, blah, blah. It's a long series of reasons. And Roosevelt basically came back to them and said, yes, I recognize all those reasons, do it anyway. So the Navy gave him one, and that was the first of it. They're called light aircraft carriers, or CVLs. The first was called the Independence. And then Pearl Harbor happened. And then they started losing the big carriers. And essentially, the Navy was reluctant to buy these ships to begin with. But once they got going and they started losing flat tops, every time they lost a big carrier at sea, they would queue up 2 or 3 of these Independence class as replacements. And there were 9 in all. Cowpens was the 4th. And they were a desperate stopgap measure. Like, if the Navy had had its way, it would be operating solely with Essex class carriers, the big ones, the big expensive gold plated carriers. But they didn't really have a choice. And there was this gap. The Essexes weren't going to be ready. The first of them weren't ready until mid 43, and they wouldn't be in sufficient numbers to replace battle losses until the end of that year or the beginning of the next. So really, what they just needed a stopgap, just something to cover that time difference between the initial losses and the Essexes arriving, and that's what the light carriers were for. And they've been overlooked because most of them were scrapped after the war. I mean, one lasted as late as '89, but most ships like the Cowpens were scrapped in the '60s. But they have two things that are going for them in terms of big historical notes. So the Battle of the Marianas, when Marianas Turkey Shoot, Battle of the Philippine Sea, which was the critical battle that broke the back of Japanese naval aviation. Half the American carrier decks in that battle were these little light carriers. So they were there for the climactic battle. They were needed. They were there when they were needed most. And the other thing that I think is a tremendous historical note is two presidents went into battle on these light carriers, not the Cowpens. Gerald Ford was aboard the Monterey, and George H.W. Bush was aboard the San Jacinto. So, they were overlooked, but important, and they were there. They were there when the Navy needed them, and afterwards were discarded.
Yeah, these little underdogs definitely pulled their weight. One thing I've noticed a few times throughout history, especially American history, is Americans aren't necessarily the best planners. We're pretty bad at planning. But with that being said, we are excellent at adapting and rallying. Sort of a testament to American resilience. And we definitely see that here.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. This is a classic case of American improvisation when our backs were against the wall, and it worked out. But boy, it was touch and go there for a while.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that I do want to commend you on, sort of something that I haven't mentioned, was your book wasn't necessarily just about the USS Cowpens and Moo, which we'll get into how it got that name, but it sort of was an entire history of, I'm gonna call it the Western Front of the Pacific Theater of the war. It sort of encompassed not just the Cowpens, but the entire um, strategy and battles that took place in that theater of the Pacific. So that was really cool. I want to talk about the crew, which is something that hits especially close to me as I was reading it. I'm 21, so reading stuff about World War II always kind of strikes a chord with me because these guys are my age. That easily could have been me if I was born 100 years ago. Um, so these are all. It's also interesting to note that at this time in America, you have to understand this. Most people grew up in their small towns or their cities and never really saw much of the country or met anyone outside of their inner circle or culture. So when you have the outbreak of war and you have a draft or anything like that, you get all of these men from all walks of life. A lot of them are fresh out of high school, all of these different cultures kind of congregating. So I would like to get into the crew. What exactly is the crew like as the Cowpens is being christened and they're manning the ship?
So the crew was about 1,300 people, not officers, and by and large, they were kids from 17 to 19 years old. The bulk of them were reservists, had never been to sea before, and by and large were just out of boot camp. A couple of them had, a few of them had technical experience. Now, part of this isn't necessarily unique to the Moo in that you have to remember the Navy was expanding from just a few hundred thousand. I think it was 136,000 or something like that in the late 1930s. That was the Navy, to 3.5 million in the space of a few years. So when you take a small force and make it into a big one, the vast bulk of people in that force are just not going to have a lot of experience. And when you add to that, that the Moo, these little light carriers, were not a prestigious assignment. If you were a Naval Academy grad or you were the best of the best, you're probably going to be on one of the big Essexes. So by and large, these guys were reservists, and by reservists I mean these were folks that had signed up for the war. They were not a professional sailor, and when the war was over, they're going to be discharged and sent home. Most of them just had a high school education. And I think you hit the nail on the head. The America of the 1940s, most people never went far from their hometowns. My grandfather never did. He was a little older than the average. He was 22 when he went to war. But he'd never been out of upstate New York. And some of the characters in the book, like George Terrell, who's a New Englander, he'd never been out of New England. And then you're thrown together in this mix with people from the deep South and the West and the Midwest, and so they're a cross section of America with one exception. And that is, we have to also remember that the Navy was segregated at the time. We often mythologize the era. This is the greatest generation. Well, they did an awful lot to be proud of, but their policies on racial segregation were not good. They were clearly unjust, and there was a small black contingent on the ship, and essentially they were messmen and stewards. It was a menial sort of support role. They weren't allowed to be in combat, although oftentimes uh, what they did aboard ship kind of pushed those boundaries. And later in the war, with Secretary Forrestal, eventually those boundaries began to really start to begin to fray. You have a first ship with an all black contingent, but it wasn't until I think 47 that they got rid of segregation entirely. So this it was the Navy as a whole was a segregated place, and it's and one of the things that I'm sad about the book is I could not find any account, and I looked from any of the the messmen, the African Americans aboard. Although I did find one from another light carrier. I would have liked to add that sort of perspective in there. But as for the rest of the ship, it was farm boys in big cities and school teachers. And once you get into the officers, even they're those guys, were also, a lot of them were also reservists, very few professionals. And, they had civilian jobs that were incredibly varied. I mean, the ship's greatest fighter pilot was a former insurance agent from Indianapolis. There's morticians and soap salesmen and bankers and guys who worked at the power company. I mean, this is a cross section of America.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary point to think about when you think about World War II. Is these guys worked normal jobs. I mean, Saving Private Ryan, Tom Hanks was a school teacher. These guys were normal civilians who were called to duty and answered that call. It's extraordinary when you think about it. But before we continue, I mean, we've alluded to it, we've mentioned it. It's the title of your book. How did it get its name, The Mighty Moo? And before we get to that, it's actually a pretty interesting story of how it actually got the name USS Cowpens, because at this time you mentioned that all of these ships and cruisers were named after battles. So how did it get the name Cowpens, and then how did it get the name Mighty Moo?
So essentially the Navy had bought these light cruisers, and the Cowpens' original name as a cruiser was the Huntington, but that was as a cruiser. And so when it was going to be converted to a carrier, they're looking for a new name for it. As you mentioned, they would name them either after battles or important ships from history, like Wasp and Hornet, had been warships back in previous American history. And so early in the war, a pharmacist from the little town of Cowpens, South Carolina, population about 1,500 people, sent a postcard to the White House, guy by the name of George Dean Martin. And he said, "Hi, would it be possible to name a ship after our Revolutionary War battle, which was right down the road?" It's not the town was named after the battle as well. It actually, but that didn't happen until late 1800s, I think. So FDR got the postcard, approved the suggestion, passed it on to the Navy, and the USS Cowpens was born. As far as the Mighty Moo, no one really knows who came up with it. Some quick wit aboard, probably coined it, and it was, even the ship's history sort of acknowledges the idea of a ship called the Cowpens. It's just ludicrous. I mean, you had to kind of smile when you said it. There's this act of the sense of whimsy about it. It was hard to take seriously, and so to double down on it.
It wasn't very intimidating.
No, it really wasn't. To double down on it and then say, "Oh yeah, well, we're the Mighty Moo." It just sort of adds to the ridiculousness, and the crew just latched onto it. However, the first captain was not a fan of not only the nickname but actually the name of the ship in general, the Cowpens. He was a legitimate naval officer. He careerist, professional. Went on to retire as a vice admiral, and he told the crew. I guess he perhaps he didn't consider it serious enough for a man of war. So he told the crew, "You're to pronounce it Cuppens." And I tell this to the people in South Carolina, and Cowpens in particular, and their first reaction is always, "Oh God," they're just appalled. And the crew just didn't listen. They played along for a little while, and then it was back to Cowpens, and then Moo, and then the Mighty Moo. So Captain McConnell lost that battle.
Yeah, Cuppins is even more ridiculous than anything else. But I do want to talk about this is transformed into an aircraft carrier. So it would be a disservice to not talk about the aviation force and how important and significant that is in this story. So, what exactly is the state of the ship's aviation force? How does that work? And how are they these new guys as the ship is brand new, these new guys coming on and training, and what sort of aircraft are they flying?
Okay, so as an aircraft carrier, their primary weapons are the aircraft they carry, and they had they started with three, and then they worked it down to two. But when they went into battle, the two types of planes that they flew were the F-6F Hellcat, which is a fighter, and then the Avenger torpedo bomber, made either by Grumman or General Motors, and the Hellcat was a fantastic aircraft. The Navy had started with the Wildcat, which sort of was at the beginning of the war was outclassed by the Japanese Zero, and then they upgraded that to the Hellcat. They also had with the Corsair. The Corsair was a very, very difficult airplane to fly. It had a nickname as the Ensign Eliminator. It was very unforgiving, but very fast and very capable. But just it was tricky. And the Hellcat was the exact opposite. It was easy to fly. It was very forgiving. It was, a new pilot could get into it and get a feel for it. It didn't have any bad habits. More American aces in World War II flew the Hellcat than any other aircraft. And over 5,200 aerial kills were recorded by Hellcats over the course of the war. And the primary weapon was it had 650 caliber machine guns, 400 rounds of ammunition per gun. And if you just pull down the trigger and hold it, that would get you 30 seconds of fire until all the guns were empty. And it's pretty remarkable that, the fighter pilots, not only on the Cowpens, but across the Navy, did an awful lot with those 400 rounds per gun. Pilots sometimes would come home and anywhere like Alex Verascio, I think is how you pronounce his name, but one of the leading aces of the war, came home with 7 kills on a single mission in the Marianas turkey shoot. We had a guy aboard the Cowpens who did 5, and another one in another mission did 4. So they're shooting an aircraft with 5 to 6 seconds of gunfire, which is pretty remarkable. Sort of given the maneuvering and the jockeying and the accuracy. They did an awful lot. But that being said, I mean the Hellcat was sort of a great utility infielder. It could carry bombs, it could carry rockets. It had a lot of advantages over the Japanese Zeke. It was heavily armored. It was very rugged to enemy fire. It had a self-sealing fuel tanks. Grumman, as the manufacturer, had a philosophy of just building its planes very rugged. So the Hellcat was a great plane to fly. So Grumman also made the Avenger, which is what my grandfather flew in. He was a tail gunner, and the Avenger started off as a torpedo bomber. That was primarily what it was designed to haul, the Navy's Mark 13 aerial torpedo. But the problem was the Mark 13 was just a mess. It was broken for 50, I'm not 50 different reasons, but for a number of different reasons. The Mark 13 was very fragile and unreliable, and it took them until basically 44 to iron the bugs out. So I think the the Cowpens only dropped there's planes only dropped torpedoes on a single occasion over the course of the war, and the rest of the time it's Avengers drop bombs and depth charges, use rockets, and it was kind of an all-purpose scout and bomber. Again, very rugged, easy to fly. It's a big aircraft. It's got a 54-foot wingspan, but it had folding wings. It was a little underpowered, but by and large, it was a good aircraft to fly. Actually, George H.W. Bush, that was the plane that he flew. So those are the two aircraft that the Cowpens went to war with.
It seems that all of the pilots, um, and their anecdotes that you have in the book, it seems all of them loved flying the Hellcat. There was one funny little story where a veteran, in his older age, went to a museum or something, and he hopped back in a Hellcat for the first time in 40 or 50 years or whatever, and he felt right at home. It was like he knew exactly, started firing up the plane, and his family's like, oh no, he's gonna take off.
It's an amazing video. Ed Haley was his name. I'm still in contact with his son Glenn, and he was a little guy to begin with, and over the course of the years he hadn't grown any taller, so his family had to help him up the stairs and into the cockpit. And once he was in it, his hands just went to the controls, and he was flipping things, and he looked like he was just fresh. He was ready to go. It was it you know it No one had a word bad to say about the Hellcat. It was a fantastic aircraft.
That's amazing. Something that I'm always very fascinated in and very curious of when thinking about aircraft carriers, and especially the Cowpens, because it's a much smaller aircraft carrier with a much smaller and condensed runway, is what's the process for taking off and landing, a plane on a ship with such a small landing platform?
So the Cowpens did have catapults. Started with one and moved up to two, but by and large, the Hellcats never needed them. So what you would do is the carrier would essentially accelerate to 30 knots, put its nose into the wind, so you've got the wind going across the flight deck, and the Hellcats would just roll off, off the deck under their own power. They had the power to do that. The Avengers were a little underpowered, as I mentioned, and so they oftentimes needed, particularly if they were heavily loaded, needed a catapult shot to get them into the air. That was not the most dangerous part of the mission, though. The dangerous part was coming in for a landing. And one of the things that the Navy tried to get FDR to not build these light carriers was because they're small. I mean, the flight deck on the Cowpens is 73 feet wide. So the Hellcat has a 42-foot wingspan, and the Avenger has a 54-foot wingspan, and the island is 6 feet wide. So that does not give you a lot of room at your wingtips. I mean, essentially, you're gonna it's one of the fighter pilots making his first landing aboard the CVL described it as like hitting a splinter with a thunderbolt. I mean, you just had to be right on. And the other thing that sort of is the eccentricities about this particular type of ship is it does not have side-mounted elevators, for moving aircraft down into the hangar deck like you see in a modern aircraft carrier. The elevators were in the center of the flight deck. So the problem is that you could not land aircraft and move them below at the same time. So what they did was they put a crash barrier halfway down the deck, and you come in for a landing, and if your tail hook doesn't catch a cable, you go into the crash barrier. And if you do land, essentially what they do is they lower the crash barrier, you roll forward, you park your plane, you spot it, and the crash barrier goes up behind it. Now, a certain number of aircraft, like if you're coming in for a landing and you're out of position, you're not going to hit a cable. The landing signals officer, who's sort of your guide on the side of the ship, he waves you off, and essentially tells you to go around, and you have a brief moment where you're supposed to pull away before you're going to go into the crash barrier. The problem was that these are big radial engines, and they generate a lot of torque. And if you're coming in low and slow, gear down, you're like perilously close to stall speed, and you jam your throttle forward, all of a sudden your engine roars to life, and the torque of that engine will flip the plane over. And there's no ejection seats. So if you hit the water inverted, that's not going to go well for you. So it could be very, very tricky on a wave off, and a pilot had to know exactly what that threshold is. You need enough power to not stall out and or land, crash alongside the ship or get caught in the catwalks, and pull away and be safe, but not so much power that the plane would flip over and kill you. So it was a pretty tricky place to land, and the CBLs, Cowpens included, had some of the highest accident rates in the fleet.
Have you ever seen the movie Devotion? It came out maybe a year or two ago. It took place during the Korean War, and it showed a lot of that. There was one scene in particular where I think a pilot got called off, and he flipped right into the ocean.
I know the exact scene you're talking about. Yeah, that was what happened. It's this is a dangerous business. I mean, even today, aircraft landing on an aircraft carrier is dangerous. Go back to World War II, is even more dangerous without so these safety measures, without ejection seats and things like that. And I talked to a guy. He was named John Ingraham. He's since passed, and he was a enlisted crewman on the ship. Later went on to be president of the American Microbiological Society. A really interesting guy. But anyway, he got to know these pilots, and he's watching, essentially these air operations, and people are getting hurt and killed, and how dangerous it is. And he felt sorry for the pilots, and then he got to know the pilots. He said the pilots were having a blast. This was great. It's kind of this dynamic. Here you are, you're 21, 22 years old, you've 2 to 4 years of college, you're invincible. And these guys were full of life, and also all the pilots were volunteers. They were there because they wanted to be. I had one guy. I asked him why he wanted to fly Hellcats. He said, "Well, Hellcats were the hottest thing, and I wanted to fly the hottest thing."
Yeah, fighter pilots tend to have bigger personalities and bigger egos, which I feel like you have to have. You have to have that confidence if you're gonna execute such a dangerous job. And it's extraordinary that in World War II, at least, I mean, these guys were from all walks of life. A lot of them had to learn trial by fire. They were just thrown into the cockpit and kind of had to figure it out.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Cowpens is not a great example of Navy training. I mean, the Navy had its pipeline. You start with like pre-flight, and you work to you slowly over time fly faster and more complicated aircraft and learn the tactics. But it was a sink or swim process. Like they didn't take the time to make sure that yeah, they didn't take the time to make sure everyone was ready for advance, and so there were a lot of accidents. I think there's like 15,000 people died either in ferry flights or in accidents as part of the war from all services. Um, and with the Cowpens, essentially, you know, all their pilots, some of them have been flight instructors, but on the previous generation of aircraft, like the Wildcat and things like that. And they had been told, well, you're going to get the Hellcat. And they're like, okay. So they'd never seen a Hellcat. They didn't know, never even sat in the cockpit, no idea. And so they're told, well, you're going to fly to Bethpage, Long Island, which is where the plant essentially, and pick up a couple of Hellcats and bring it back to Willow Groves, which was their airfield. This is summer of '43, and so the day they're supposed to go out to Long Island, they walk out in the flight line, and what's sitting out there but two Hellcats, and they'd been delivered overnight. And they're like, okay, well, I guess we're having to figure out how these things work. And so the Bob Price, I mentioned him earlier, who's commander of the fighter squadron, and his deputy, a guy by the name of Gaylord Brown, sat down, read the pilot's manuals front to back, got in the cockpit, familiarized themselves with the cockpit. Like, okay, we can do this. And then they just took off. They flew around, got the feel for it, came down, said, okay, we're Hellcat instructors, and taught the rest of their pilots how to fly it. The same was true with the Avenger. They'd never, when they were issued Avengers, they'd never seen one before. So I would presume that some of the pilots in the bigger carriers got a little better training than this. It seemed a little seat of the pants.
It's extraordinary. Another testament to American adaptability. But after the Cowpens was commissioned, it was sent to Pearl Harbor, and the men are given some time to enjoy the island. And this is always an interest of mine as a young guy to hear about not just the destruction and brutality side of war, but also, I mean, you're out in these exotic places in the world with your boys, your brothers, developing these deep bonds, getting to reap the fruits of these exotic fun places. So what exactly were the guys getting up to when they weren't necessarily on duty?
So, pre World War II, Hawaii is a really interesting place. There's a lot going on here, and essentially, it is the last stop for you before you go out to the war zone. And the number of sailors in Oahu in Pearl Harbor is absolutely enormous, and you wait in line for everything. You know, I think there was a bar, movie theater, or brothel. There's a line. There's sailors everywhere, or Marines or soldiers, and it, people. If you go back to American culture in the 1930s, movies were entranced with Hawaii. It was sort of this. They presented it as this tropical paradise. Heaven on earth, hula girl under every palm tree, and that was very much in the American cultural consciousness of the wartime generation. But once you actually get out to Pearl Harbor, I mean, it's a wartime shipyard. It's filled with soldiers and sailors. The male to female ratio is several hundred to one. Everything is expensive, so it was for a lot of folks on board the Cowpens. They called it the Rock. It was just too expensive. The novelty was great for the first couple of trips, and after that, it was just whatever. But there's a lot of drinking. There's a lot of smoking. All the usual vices that sailors get involved with, and for many of them, their last chance, before you're going to be on this carrier. As the war went on, the recreation centers that the Navy set up on these little Pacific atolls were even more sort of primitive. So this was last chance for the sailors to enjoy sort of civilization's vices.
Yeah, a lot of degeneracy. These were some of my favorite aspects of the book. It was very fun to read and especially hear the firsthand accounts of what was going on. But Cowpens, it gets its first taste of action at Wake Island. You have a very green crew, probably a lot of jitters. They're finally going to war for the first time. How does this first take first taste of action go at Wake Island?
Badly. In fact, it was a bit of a disaster. And perhaps the way to sort of set the stage for this was not the first time Cowpen's luck had gone badly. And in fact, up to this point, she'd had a series of incidents that were starting to make her crew wonder if she had a jinx. So when the air group flew aboard the ship for the first time, they botched their landings. One guy went into the drink. There were several crashes. On their shakedown cruise, they're going into Norfolk and they get tangled in an anti torpedo net, anti submarine net. You know, it wraps around one of their screws, the propellers, and strands the ship for 3 days. The captain actually receives an official admonishment in his record. That you, Captain McConnell, erred in allowing this to happen. They get out to the war zone, and their first mission is at Wake, and it's a disaster. The very first plane taking off just sort of goes a little bit to the left and goes off the side into the drink without ever taking flight. Uh, you had two aircraft to take off, never seen or heard from again. They just, on the first combat mission, they took off and they're gone. No one knows what happened. Maybe they collided in midair. Maybe they got vertigo. You know, the very next day, some pilots from another plane got vertigo. You know, they're taking off sort of in the pre-dawn dark, and if you can't see the horizon, sometimes folks get the spins essentially, and it's tough for them to maintain their spatial orientation. They get over the island. Number of combat casualties, including the air group commander, is shot down. Another guy's shot down and seen alive in a raft, and he waves, "I'm okay," and then is never seen or heard from again. Mark Grant, the air group commander, is picked up by a submarine, and part of it is bad tactics. They were very enthusiastic. They wanted to make a good impression, to do well. You know, if you flash forward 6 months and ask these same guys what they should do in a similar situation, they would tell you one pass and haul ass. You know, don't if you make a second run on the target, the enemy gunners are going to have a good crack at you because they know they're coming. So you basically come, you hit them once, and you get out. And this time they were just going strafing run after strafing run after strafing run, and you know the gunfire really started to take a toll. Some of these planes came back to the Cowpens. One of the pilots described it as having more holes than Swiss cheese. So these guys had a lot to learn. It didn't go well for them, and you know I talked a little bit about Bob Price and saying how difficult that operation was, and familiar faces go by the wayside. It was written after this operation, because this was a tight knit group of guys. They were very very close. To give an example, so one of the two pilots who disappeared without a place or trace was last name McIlwain. Big Mac is what they called him. He's a big guy, and he just no one knows what happened to him. And his roommate, years later, gave one of his sons the middle name McIlwain in order to sort of pay tribute to his friends. These were guys that had been together less than 6 months, and he was so moved by his loss that he would name one of his children after him. So it gives you an idea of like how you know it was tough for them. It was really really hard for them. But it was this blooding was something that they had to. It's part of the process. You just have to season yourself to it, get better at it, and unfortunately, some of that is the getting used to psychologically losing folks.
That's intense, man. I can't imagine. And it was around this time that the Cowpens jinx phrase was sort of coined, which of course you reference in the subtitle of the book. But I would like to touch on there was another island that, they had to take by whatever, but it was the island of Truk or Truk, however you want to pronounce it. And there was a lot of mystique surrounding this island, and it was building a lot of um, fear and anxiety because people thought it was this secretive, formidable Japanese stronghold. So can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure. So, sort of geographically speaking, the Navy is going westward through the South Pacific along a series of islands. They start at the Gilberts, they go to the Marshalls, and then they get into the Carolines. And Truk, Truk, however you want to pronounce it, was an island in sort of central western the Caroline Islands. I've actually been there, done some diving there, and it's a really interesting place. It's a atoll, and you've got multiple little islets within it, and the atoll is I forget the exact how many miles it is wide, but it's a really large atoll. It's so big that the Japanese Navy were doing high speed exercises inside the coral reef without ever actually going out into the ocean. And it's deep. The water there can be 200 or 300 feet deep, so you can bring in a big battleship and anchor it no problem. So the Japanese had made it one of their logistical hubs for the war, because it was sort of a fork in the road. Like if you were coming down from the Japanese home islands through the Philippines, if you were going down to say Rabaul or east into the central Pacific, Truk was a place that you would do that, and so it was a big logistical depot. Now we kind of take for granted, sort of having the geographic knowledge of some of these places, but there was no Google Earth, there was no social media, and the Japanese had essentially gotten a mandate to rule the South Pacific after World War One, and they'd sort of expanded that, and then they just shut it down to Westerners. So Americans had never been to this place; they knew very little about it. The commander of the operation, Mark Mitscher, said that the only thing he knew about Truk was what he read in National Geographic. There's all these crazy rumors that no white man, no spy had ever gone in there and lived to tell the tale, that Amelia Earhart had been shot down because she was trying to take pictures of Truk. Like the rumor mill was going nuts on this, and they called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific because it was a Japanese stronghold, and supposedly defended by elite fighter pilots and swarming with guns and blah blah blah. So the pilots were told you're going to hit Truk, and they're like, "Ooh boy," they were a little worried about this because at the time, particularly early in the war, there was some uncertainty that carriers could take on a land base and get away with it. That they were too vulnerable. So it was the operation was called Hailstone, and the Japanese had been tipped off. Essentially, they knew the Americans were coming. They had just a couple 3 days notice, and they had their combined fleet there, a lot of their big warships, and all those got out of town essentially with a handful of exceptions. But what was left was a lot of merchant ships, and in the space of a 2-day operation, the U.S. Navy went to town on these merchant ships and sunk just a tremendous number of. I forget the exact number in terms of tonnage. Having been there, dove on several of these wrecks. We're talking dozens. And the Cowpens was part of this operation. They were there the first day when a lot of the fighting was, and they sunk a light cruiser, which was a pretty big deal for them. And also they did some bombing of airfields, because essentially the Japanese had now they wanted this base to be a land based aircraft carrier. It was an unsinkable aircraft carrier, I think is what they described it. So it was a number of airfields there, and so the Cowpens guys did their business and bombed the heck out of the fields, and then. The following day was kind of a letdown. There wasn't a lot of fighting there. Cowpens was not on the rotation for that, and then they made a run for it. So it was a 2-day raid, did a lot of damage, and it was a real confidence builder for these guys. After Wake, that they'd gotten bloodied at Wake, and now they're at Truk, and they'd sunk a light cruiser, and they made some night landings under very difficult circumstances. There was a rescue. A guy was shot down, picked up by a float plane. Brought back to base safely. So it went really well for them. And afterwards, there was one pilot, they were talking about the next operation and said, it went so well at Truk and we think we can take them again. So for them, that was, kind of the point at which they're starting to gel as a team.
Yeah, exactly. That's a point that I was gonna make. It seems after Truk that this is really where the pilots and the ship as a whole really starts to gel into a cohesive fighting unit. Moving to the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, which is, of course, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which you mentioned earlier. It was the largest carrier battle of the war. This is what really cripples the Japanese Naval Aviation Force. I guess you could call it a huge turning point in the war because it's just sort of gradual decline of the Japanese force. I want to really flesh this out here. So, walk me through the whole ordeal. I want to start at the alarm. What what it really looks like when these naval aviation engagements commence. So I want to start at the alarm. So this is the pre-dawn hours, like 3, 4 a.m. The alarm goes off to wake everyone up, wake up the pilots. What's the scene on the ship?
Sure. So everyone knew there was going to be a battle that day. The U.S. submarines had been tracking the Japanese as they approached, and had been radioing to the carrier task force essentially their location and position. And so the night before, essentially the pilots were briefed up that the fight was coming. Nobody really knew exactly how it would go down, but folks were on alert. And there was perhaps a little bit of nervousness in that, the conventional wisdom in carrier warfare was that the side that struck first had the advantage, but in the U.S. side here, Admiral Spruance opted to do the exact opposite, in that he was protecting the landing beaches there on Saipan and Marianas. And so he was standing guard on them. He didn't want to go off and chase the Japanese fleet and leave them unguarded. So essentially, the plan was to stay put, to guard the landing beaches and let the Japanese come to them, which is sort of defies the conventional wisdom. So the alarm on the Cowpens went off at 3 or 4 a.m., well before dawn, enough time to get everybody up, feed them, prepare them, and it was anticipated that the fighting would begin at dawn. But the Japanese, at least the carrier aviators, was kind of a no-show initially there at the break of dawn. There was some fighting over Guam, which was one of the islands there a little further to the north. The Cowpens wasn't involved in, but those were all land-based planes. So the carrier pilots aboard the Mu are sitting in their ready room, and they're just kind of tense. They know a fight is coming. It hasn't happened. It hasn't arrived yet. Nobody knows why the Japanese haven't showed up on radar scenes. And one of the Cowpens pilots talking about it afterwards, he described it like a locker room before a big game. Sort of nervous butterflies and little conversation. And in a lot of the other carriers, or some of the other carriers, when the Japanese didn't appear at dawn, some guys went off to breakfast. They went off to bed. They kind of took a nap. They relaxed their guard a little bit. So when the Japanese did finally start showing up on radar screens a little bit later, the Cowpens pilots were essentially ready to go. And they normally, there's sort of a process by which that they would, get to their planes. They do general quarters. They go to the ready room. They get briefed up, and then they go pilots man your plane, and then they go out and essentially climb to their aircraft. But it was all just compressed. It was like a true scramble. General quarters went off again. The announcement for pilots man your planes, and the only instructions given were get in the first plane you can. Don't take off as fast as you can. Don't worry about your assigned wingmen. Don't worry about forming up with the people that you normally, or as a squadron or a section or division rather. Just get in the air, head west. And essentially it's a foot race out onto the deck, and people just the pilots climbed into the first plane that was available, started up their engine, and off they went. We talked a little earlier about how this is a squadron that started off badly, or at the very least just very inexperienced. And so this was the moment at which I think they really gelled and became the pros that they eventually became, because Cowpens pilots were the first aircraft in the Fast Carrier Task Force to get their fighters off the deck. And it was about 2 minutes between the pilots man your plane and the first of our Hellcats lifting off the deck. So a tremendous achievement for the little carrier that could, and a tremendous sort of professional evolution from guys who started off with seemingly everything against them.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that this sort of defensive posture is against conventional wisdom in carrier warfare. Why is it that it worked out so well in this particular case?
Well, there's a number of things they had going for them. First off, the American carriers outnumbered the Japanese. The American carrier pilots are more experienced than the Japanese. You have to remember that we talked a little bit about this earlier. When the war started, the Japanese were the best in the world in terms of carrier aviation. They had a training program that was designed to produce a small number of incredibly elite pilots. But what they couldn't do is produce larger numbers of pilots. And as the war progressed, the casualties among the Japanese naval aviation cadre were extremely heavy. The fighting down in Rabaul was terrible, and all the previous carrier fights, Midway being one. It was very difficult for them to replace their pilots in the numbers that they had replace sort of the elite pilots in the numbers that they needed. And so their standards had slipped a little bit. And roving submarines also didn't help matters in terms of, U.S. subs were on the carriers and staked out where they were, where they were sheltering down south in the southern ends of the Philippines. So it's not like they could even the carriers could take to the sea to get their guys some practice. So the Japanese were not the elite adversary that there had been, 2 years prior. And then when you add to that the numerical disadvantage, they were starting from a pretty big deficit.
Interesting. So even going into the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese aviation force was already in decline. This was just even more of a crushing blow.
Yeah, this was the hammer. I'm sorry, the nail in the coffin of Japanese aviation. That they were never. This was it. They were never used in this way again for the rest of the war. They really only made one other big appearance, and that was the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October. And they were bait. They just didn't have. They didn't have the pilots to pose a serious threat like they'd done in Syria in previous battles. But this was the one that put the U.S. naval aviation superiority on top.
So you're very descriptive of the dogfighting that takes place during this battle and the action that's taking place in the air. Obviously, it's going to be hard to follow reading words on a page with the intense action of a dogfight, but you do a very good job of telling the many different perspectives of many different pilots who were flying in the air that day. So once these two aviation forces converge, what's the action like in the air?
So Cowpens. So essentially, the way they had sort of set up the day, 8 of Cowpens' planes were already in the air on what's called combat air patrol. They were up at dawn, and so essentially they're just circling overhead. Early in the war, our pilots had learned that essentially if you have planes up all the time, that allows you to really cut down on reaction time. And then they had 16 more that were on the deck ready to go. So when the Japanese appeared on radar, essentially several carriers had their planes in the air, and Cowpens was one of the first to actually encounter. There were a couple of others that beat them there, but just within the first few minutes of the battle, its first 8 fighter were in the mix, and essentially, even in those early moments, things were not going well for the Japanese. As the pilots approached, they could see the enemy formation scattering. Some of the other U.S. Hellcats were a little ahead of them, started breaking that up, and already burning planes were starting to fall from the sky. So it quickly descended into a melee, and what started as a group of Cowpens fighters working together, folks just sort of scattered and chased whoever they could find. And oftentimes there were more Hellcats than Japanese planes, so there was always I'm not going to say intense competition, but there oftentimes there's a number of American fighters trying to get in on a Japanese plane. At the same time, you had your 16 alert fighters. They all get off the deck, and essentially, as I mentioned, their orders were just go west. And the pilots described how they were what they described as hanging on their propellers to gain altitude as absolutely as fast as possible.
Interesting. So you mentioned earlier that one of the reasons for the downfall of the Japanese aviation force was their inability to pump out large numbers of pilots. It also seems that their sort of samurai mindset and way of life with the whole kamikaze thing also kind of played a hand in this. Do you think that the rapid decline of the Japanese isn't just a testament to the inadequacy of their training program? Not the inadequacy, because it was a very, you know, prestigious training program, but their inability to pump out numbers. Do you think as well, on top of that, it was their kamikaze mindset, or a third factor I'll introduce is just the Americans becoming superior pilots by experience?
You know, culture is always an important part of military performance. And some of that is national culture, some of that is institutional culture. You know, there are different organizations, they bring in a certain set of assumptions. I mean, culture is a set of assumptions and values, really, about how they do what they do. And some of these cultures, not necessarily like, I'm not talking like ethnic cultures, but like institutional or organizational cultures are better at some things than others. The Japanese military culture was very, very good, particularly early in the war, in getting as close as possible to perfection. These guys were absolutely fantastic at their jobs. The Americans had a completely different culture, and there's, I'm not going to say seat of the pants, but it was a great deal of, was improvised. This huge training program started because of necessity, and just went full out, all out. And they had a very different approach, in that it was, they were their objective was to train large numbers of pilots who were pretty good. They didn't have the time to be absolute, sort of get to that high fever pitch of skill that the Japanese had early in the war, but they didn't need to. They also had numbers in their part. So a completely different approach. And I think certainly the Japanese mindset, in terms of, the samurai warrior culture is, focused on attaining perfection in so many different ways, that simply is not necessarily true in the American military culture. I'm not necessarily denigrating, sort of the roots of either, but one was far better suited to adapt to the circumstances than the other, and that quickly began to manifest on the battlefield.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think that sort of their commitment to excellence kind of did play into their downfall a little bit with the whole kamikaze thing, and just their will. Yeah, it got in the way, I think is a good way to put it, and their willingness to give their life for their emperor. And I think you do make a great point about Americans' culture sort of being a seat of the pants type of thing. We talked earlier, Americans are terrible planners, but they're amazing adapters. They're very resilient, and you do see this play out over the course of the Pacific theater. But after the Philippine Sea, they moved back to Pearl Harbor, and the air crew was dismissed, or the whole crew was dismissed, and a new air crew took over. And this happens a couple times throughout the book, maybe 3 or 4 times. But what's the process like of switching air crews, a totally new air crew with a totally new culture and personality coming onto the ship? And a lot of them are experienced in green or inexperienced.
So the crew, the people who operate the ship, run its boilers and systems, and the guys who are aboard, what you think of as a sailor, were largely there for the duration of the war. Folks who started with the ship in summer of 1943 in Philadelphia, many of them were still there when the Japanese surrender happened in August of 1945. There was a little rotation, but by and large they stayed put. The air groups, however, I mean, these are essentially, these guys are the spearhead for the Cowpens. They're the ones who see in combat every day, and combat takes a toll. And over time, not only mounting casualties, but just fatigue catches up with pilots. And so then what the Navy does is essentially anywhere between a 6 and 9 month operational tour, and then they send them home. And when they get them home, they break up the squadron. We talked a little bit about institutional culture. One of the things that the Americans did very well is when these squadrons came home, the air groups, essentially they picked off a few experienced pilots and they sent them to an instructor school to teach brand new pilots, hey, this is what combat is like. Japanese didn't do any of that. Training was seen as an unglamorous, unsamurai-like job. And then you get new folks, and they join the squadron, and then eventually it's refitted and sent back out to assign to a new carrier. So Cowpens started with Air Group 25. Over the course of, they were, first combat mission was in October of 43. They're sent home in the summer of 44. If you just look at the original pilots who joined the squadron in the United States in 43, they suffered 40% casualties, which is pretty amazing in terms of just heavy. And still they kept their cohesion. They were still a very tight group. And as they went along, they got new pilots, and it took, I'm not necessarily, the 40% doesn't count the additional casualties for the replacement pilots. But so they were pretty worn down by the end of the Marianas turkey shoot, just in terms of combat fatigue. They're replaced by Air Group 22, which was my grandfather's air group. They had done most of a deployment on another one of the light carriers, the Independence. She had been torpedoed off Tarawa, and the squadron, Air Group 22, had been sent back to the United States with their carrier to be patched up. They reformed in California and came back out and were reassigned to the Cowpens. So these were guys that had already seen combat, in terms of the ships. Say, for instance, like Clem Craig was it turned out to be the ship's greatest fighter ace. When he arrived aboard the Cowpens, he already had, I think, 2.5 or 2.25 aerial kills to his credit. So these guys were not rookies. However, there was some bad dynamics in the air group. The pilots, I only have a limited sort of number of perspectives on this. I would have liked to have found more about it, but best I can tell, the fighter pilots didn't get along with the torpedo pilots, and this was even before they arrived in the Cowpens. Then they deploy to the Cowpens, and quickly the air group, its senior pilots, end up at odds with Captain Taylor, who was replaced Captain McConnell as the ship's second command. And he was not impressed by these guys. He thought they were a little big for their britches, and the feeling was mutual. The pilots didn't much care for him. They thought he was kind of mean-spirited and didn't really engage with them in a way that Captain McConnell had done. So it's unusual. You don't often sort of see this, but you get some real disagreements, a little bit of man drama aboard the ship that unfortunately gets in the way of the performance as time goes on. And when you add to that, they're spending more time in combat. Air Group 22, essentially by this point, the fighting had pushed closer to the Philippines. They're not going back and forth from Pearl Harbor anymore. They're based in forward bases in the Caroline Islands and a few other places, and essentially they're spending more time in combat and less time in transit. So a bad environment is made worse by greater strain, more casualties.
Interesting. The clashing of egos is always a ever prevalent factor in war. I'm always fascinated. It's one of my fascinations to study when it comes to war is the role ego plays in war, especially with commanders. I mean, you have so many notorious commanders throughout history who just have infamous egos. But one of the most important events that take place in the book is the Typhoon Cobra, which I'm gonna coin the term for the title of this chapter, the climax of terror. I think that's a fitting term because the men who went through this described this as the most intense, terrifying experience of the entire war. I mean, these are guys who are head to head with a brutal Japanese force intent on destroying them, up in the air in dogfights. And they say none of this even compares to this storm. So, this storm is out at sea, by far the scariest for all of them. It's a massive typhoon in the Pacific. So, what's the scene on board the ship of this massive storm?
So December 1944. So General MacArthur has landed at Leyte Gulf, and his troops are pressing inland, but the weather has been terrible, and the Army Air Corps is having difficulty getting airfields in the Philippines from which they can support the Army forces moving in. So General MacArthur keeps coming back to Admiral Halsey, who is recently taken charge of the fast carrier task force. He took charge that fall, asking them for air support. So they're shuttling back and forth essentially over the course of the fall. They hit targets in the Philippines, trying to thin down a Japanese aircraft that might threaten the landing beaches. Then they return to Ulithi or Majuro for rest and repairs. So December comes along. They had essentially just finished a rest and restocking trip out to, I believe it was Ulithi, or I can't remember if it was Majuro, but in any event, they had gone ashore, filled up in terms of food, supplies, bombs, new planes, whatever they needed, and turned around and were heading for the Philippines. Now, the thing is, I think we, as people living in the 21st century world, we often take for granted modern meteorological science. We do not, the 1940s, they had no weather satellites. They could see where a storm was. There were very few weather stations across the Pacific. Basically the Central Pacific was just a big empty space when it came to weather reports. So and this is also a place where typhoons essentially begin their development and then work their way towards the Philippines. So Admiral Halsey was operating in the dark. He didn't necessarily understand or know how close the storm was. even what direction it was coming from. And he tried over the course of a day or a day and a half. I mean, the sea was showing all the signs of an approaching storm, but he didn't realize it was very, very close. He tried over the course of a day or a day and a half to try and get away from it, turning north, south, variety of different directions, and couldn't do it. And in the end, Third Fleet steamed right into it. Um, I think you hit the nail on the head. My grandfather, this was one of the few things he did talk about. He was terrified in this storm. And most of the documentary material I've gotten, the Cowpens Veterans Association actually sent out a flyer in the early 80s asking people to provide their experiences in the typhoon. And, I have all those documents. And almost everybody said the exact same thing. This was the scariest part of the entire war for them. It was far worse than combat. And what was going on was, the ship, as I mentioned earlier, was narrow and tall. It had a high center of gravity, and so it was tippy. And you've got these enormous waves, sometimes 70 feet or more, or winds of 100 to 120 knots, and the ship is rolling back and forth for hours at an end. There was a roll meter on the bridge. Captain DeBaun, Taylor had passed over to DeBaun, and Captain DeBaun described how essentially the roll meter went from 45 degrees one side to 45 degrees the other side, and there was a needle at both ends. And essentially, when the ship was rolling in the waves in the typhoon, it would hit that needle at 45 and bounce on the peg a little bit, and then roll back the other direction and bounce on the peg on the other side. So the ship was rolling in excess of 45 degrees. The edge of the flight deck, which is 70 feet above the water in calm seas, was dipping into the ocean. Guys on the bridge could reach out and touch green water. The ship was taking water down its smokestacks, and the official report of the storm from the Cowpens, there was a line in there that said something to the effect of, when an aircraft carrier is taking water down its stacks, God is near everyone on that vessel. So to make matters worse, the bombs break loose in the magazine, and the magazine had been stocked to overflowing. Essentially, the bombs, they filled up all the racks that were built for bombs, and then they were essentially went beyond that and put more bombs in there, including some 2,000-pound bombs that the racks weren't designed to hold, and lash them in place. But they break loose, so you've got these bombs that are rolling across the across the floor of the magazine in the compartment. And they said the 500-pounders were bouncing like tennis balls. The 2,000-pounders were slamming into the bulkhead walls with such force that Captain DeBaun on the bridge could hear it, feel it, 7 decks up. And then they had a fire on the flight deck. One of the fully loaded Hellcats slid off the side and was burning, and men had to go out onto the deck with fire hoses to try and prevent the fire from spreading to other aircraft that had been spotted there in anticipation of flying. So everything that could go wrong, did go wrong. They came right up to the brink of capsizing, and walked away. And sort of give a sense for how dangerous it was. 3 destroyers in this storm capsized and sank, killed almost 800 men. A couple of others had very close calls, rolls of 75 degrees, and then recovered. This was an incredibly dangerous experience, and folks aboard were just, absolutely, absolutely terrified.
That is absolutely astonishing. I mean, Mother Nature can be beautiful, but she can also be terrifying. I mean, can you imagine being aboard an aircraft carrier? We all know how massive. I mean, this is a smaller aircraft carrier, but still a massive ship, listing 45 to 50 degrees each side. I mean, it's almost hard to picture. It's one of the reasons I am definitely not a sailor. If I were to join the military, it would not be the Navy, unfortunately. But I would be beside myself if I was aboard this. I mean, I've been fishing offshore in the Keys before, and it was maybe like 10 to 12 foot seas. But we're in a center console fishing boat, and the walls of the waves are going above the horizon, so you're almost like enclosed in water. It's a terrifying and very unenjoyable experience. But yeah, but I mean, 800 men lost. I think you said 3 destroyers, but the Moo didn't really take that much damage, did it?
She came out the other end, as the reporting says, materially able to fight. I mean, she was beaten up. She lost her radar dish. There was some cracks in the bulkhead, and they lost a couple of whaleboats. One man lost his life. But by and large, if they'd said, we need you to run combat missions, close air support in the Philippines, they could have done it. And that was a point of pride. And in fact, the captain and a few members of his senior staff were a bit insulted that the whole, essentially the Third Fleet went back to port. They were ready to go, and I think they felt good that their little ship had come out, seen the worst that Mother Nature could offer, and come out the other side unharmed. But the fleet returned after a massive sea and air rescue effort. Returned back to port to ride out the holidays and repair damage.
There's actually an interesting little story or anecdote to come out of this. A very important man who would go on to serve as president of the United States was present during this Typhoon Cobra, which would be Gerald Ford. So, can you tell me Gerald Ford's experience?
So Gerald Ford was a junior officer on the Monterey. Monterey was another one of the Moose sister ships, a fellow light carrier, and he'd been on the overnight shift right as the storm was approaching, and then woke up when general quarters was called. And Monterey had a real bad time of it. They had a fire break out in their hangar deck, and essentially even the captain was down there working a hose. It was bad. And when the general quarters was called, Ford rushed from his bunk essentially wanted to get up to the bridge. But unfortunately, one of the quirks of the ship is, in order to do that on a light carrier, you have to go outside. You have to go from the body of the ship onto the flight deck and then into the island. And in so doing, he was going across the flight deck, and Monterey gave a lurch, and he went sliding down the deck, headed for ocean. Because it was, again, one of these big rolls like the Cowpens was experiencing. And the only thing that saved his life was there's a little ledge of metal. It's about an inch or an inch and a half high, that goes around the outside of the flight deck. It's called a deck combing, and it's there essentially to prevent, if you dropped a hammer or a screwdriver, to prevent it from rolling off the ship and into the ocean. And he just managed to catch that with his fingertips and hang on, and then drop down into the catwalk to live another day. And he talked about this in his autobiography, the storm and sort of his experience of terror in it, and then went on to comment that when he took over the presidency after Watergate and Richard Nixon's resignation, he thought back on the storm, and it was a great metaphor for where America was at that moment. This little ship tossed, storm tossed, and they were just trying to steer through to calmer weather. And he just thought that, I think he said, it was a marvelous metaphor for the ship of state.
Wow, we were about an inch away from a very different history, post World War II. I actually have a pretty big interview coming up about Watergate. So it'll be, it's interesting. Could have gone very differently had he been an inch away from catching himself. But the war goes on, and the American forces are pushing further and further east, or further and further west, and the Japanese force is kind of dwindling. The men are tired after this long and weary war, but they get word that it's time to hit the mainland. It's time to go for Tokyo. And this reinvigorates them with all sorts of enthusiasm and new life, because they're finally hitting the Japanese right at home, right in the capital of Japan. So, what exactly are the operations that they're going to start conducting in mainland Japan? It's just to target the last little bit of the fleet that's holed up there, right?
So this sort of happens over about a 6 month period. They did an initial wave of raids in April 45, and it's in Air Group 22. My grandfather's air group had turned over to Air Group 46. They were only aboard about a month before Cowpens shipped back home to get overhauled. She was in very bad shape, just wear and tear. I mean, just it steamed. By the end of the war, she'd steamed 211,000 miles. So that gives you sort of a sense of the mileage. But they made an initial series of raids in spring of 45 on Tokyo, and they'd been warned that this could be the biggest biggest aerial battle of the war, that the Japanese would fight them, take to the eyes. And by and large, resistance was pretty muted, and they didn't know quite what to make of that. Now, another factor in there was the weather was terrible, and they made two tries at Tokyo. In both cases, the overcast, rainy. It was very difficult to find the target. So the initial raids didn't do much. Cowpens goes home, gets her overhaul, which she desperately needs, and she's back in action in summer 45, arrives in July, and the war is almost over. And the way that historians describe, what uh, the Fast Carrier Task Force was doing it, they called it the fleet that came to stay. Previous parts of the war, essentially what they would do is they'd raid. The carriers would sort into a place, they'd hit it for 2 to 3 days, and then they'd withdraw. And in this case, essentially, the fast carriers are moving up and down the Japanese coast, and they're not leaving. They're being resupplied at sea. They're hitting anything they can find to bring the cost of the war home to the Japanese. And still, Japanese resistance is pretty muted. And what was going on at the time, many of the intelligence officers and the admirals had thought that the Japanese were beaten. This was this was a dead horse. They just don't have it left in them. And the reality was actually something very different, that the Japanese had decided to sort of hazard their remaining resources, hold them in reserve until the invasion. So they had planes that they weren't using. They were hiding them under haystacks and in villages and undercover wherever they could find it. They had gasoline and that they had set aside, and they were just waiting for the Americans to come ashore to essentially do as much damage as they could.
Interesting. So that's an interesting decision by the Japanese to reserve all of their aircraft in expectation for a mainland invasion of Japan, which was a huge topic of debate. But that all was ultimately squashed by one of the most controversial decisions in world history, the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the Cowpens and the American naval force, they start to withdraw from Japan, and they're pushed away from Japan, and everyone on board is, because these guys, they're just following orders, doing what they're told on a day-to-day basis. They're not aware of the commands that are being given to the higher ups, and they're being pulled away, and they're questioning, why are we're hammering Japan, why are we pulling back? A lot of them don't know, and then all of a sudden word comes in that Americans have dropped this extraordinary weapon on Japan. And without seeing the atomic bomb, I mean, you can imagine the guys on board just hearing letters or news. They can't imagine what sort of weapon was dropped. A lot of them have conflicting feelings. So can you walk me through sort of the sentiment on the ships of the guys as they hear about these weapons of mass destruction that were dropped?
Yeah. So, by way of background, virtually no one, with the exception of Admiral Halsey and I think just a couple of his key lieutenants, had been briefed on what was about to happen in terms of the A bomb, and they had pulled the fast carriers out of the way for about a week, just to make sure that if this was far more devastating than they thought, there would be tremendous radioactive fallout or whatever, that they would be well away from it. And you're right, people were used to Admiral Halsey. Admiral Halsey's a hard charger, and he always just, attack, 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 attack. And all of a sudden, they kind of leave for a week, and they're just sort of steaming up and down the Japanese coast, not doing much. And people really kind of wondered what the heck was going on. This was very un-Halsey. And I think at one point there was an excuse made that there was a storm coming. Well, everybody knows that Halsey's got a bad history of storms, so that made sense. But even still, it started to raise some suspicions that maybe something was up. So news of the first atomic bombing arrives aboard the Mu in August, and the reaction is, it sounds more like science fiction than science. People didn't really understand what was going on. One of the senior admirals in the fleet, actually, someone had to explain to him what the word atomic meant. Like, this was completely out of left field. But as information slowly trickled out to the fleet, it sort of got the crux of it. This is a single bomb that can destroy an entire city, and there were a couple of camps on board in terms of, like, okay, how do we respond to this? Most of folks were in the, I don't want to have to invade Japan, and this, I want to get home to my family, and I am in favor of anything that we do that will shorten the war and will accelerate that process. I talked to one veteran who had this recurring nightmare that he was going to be reassigned to a landing craft in the invasion and would die in the invasion. And so for him, he was like, this is absolutely the best thing ever, because he was convinced he was going to get killed in the invasion. But there were a couple aboard who said, well, this seems like a really awful, brutal way to go about this. Why are we doing this? We can just essentially we quarantined, we blockaded all of Japan. We're starving them, and we're bombing them conventionally. Eventually, that will bring them to their knees. And that was a view actually shared by Admiral King in Washington. So he wasn't in this case the particular tail gunner, Avenger tail gunner was not completely out in left field. This was a legitimate view. But yeah, complete surprise, shock, and it, it, ex, it, excitement. I think they wanted the war to be over, and this was an important step for them to get there.
Yeah, one of the most debated, extensively debated decisions throughout history. But despite the controversy, this does force the Japanese to surrender, and this gives way for one of the crowning achievements of the Mighty Mu throughout her career, which was that she was the first ship or the first aircraft carrier and the only aircraft carrier in Tokyo Bay to facilitate the surrender and occupation. But it's actually an interesting decision. The man who chose that, I believe it was Halsey, and he actually kind of had a soft spot towards the Mu. So can you walk me through the decision for sort of its crowning achievement?
Sure. The thing to remember is that Americans had a lot of baggage with the Japanese. This was they had been double crossed once at Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese had committed terrible atrocities over the course of the war, and from the lowest sailor to the admirals, there was very little trust in the Japanese when they said that we surrender, that they meant it, and there were many people who thought that this sort of it was a ruse, essentially, that the Japanese would announce they would surrender, the Americans would come sailing into Tokyo Bay, and it would be an ambush, essentially, that they would swarm them with kamikazes and try and kill as many Americans as possible. So Admiral Halsey sort of had two problems on his hand. One, he needed to provide at least one of his aircraft carriers to go into Tokyo Bay with a variety of other ships to be there for the surrender, but also to serve as sort of a logistical depot to support the occupation forces that were going ashore. And the other thing is, because he didn't trust the Japanese, he wanted to protect his big carriers, his fleet carriers. He didn't want, if this was an ambush, a double cross, he didn't want them there in Tokyo Bay to get damaged or destroyed. And so he chose to solve both those problems simultaneously by sending the Cowpens in as the only U.S. aircraft carrier into Tokyo Bay. Now, as I mentioned, she was not alone. There was a lot of firepower in that force, battleships and cruisers and all that, but she was the only American flat top there. Aboard the ship, there was some speculation that the reason why she got the honor was because Halsey's daughter, Margaret, had christened the Cowpens. But probably the reality of it was she was expendable. And it's sort of this irony that it was her greatest, it was her moment of greatest glory. And it was not because of the tremendous things she'd done, the skill of her pilots, the bravery of her crew, but because, if she was damaged or destroyed, that was okay. The big carriers were fine.
Yeah, it's sort of an unfortunate reality. Um, but I have one more sort of one-off question that I would like to ask, sort of unrelated to any of this. But before we close out, how do you think a fight would play out between the Hellcat and the P-51 Mustang? Because the P-51 Mustang had come along over more so in the European theater of war. It was an Air Force aircraft, taking off from runways on land. The Hellcat's obviously a naval aviation aircraft, but they're both very esteemed aircraft that many men found very fond of. So how do you think a dogfight would play out between the Hellcat and the Mustang?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it's kind of a weasel answer. I think it all comes down to the pilot. And really the pilot is the heart and soul of an aircraft, and they both had things that were going for them in terms of different capabilities. The P-51 was much longer ranged, but it was not as resilient to battle damage. It had its engine, you know, you could shoot it up pretty easily, and it would conk out. Where the Hellcat had a radial engine, was shorter range, was probably a lot more resilient to battle damage. I mean, armament was about the same, and both of them were operating in the Pacific. So I guess it would depend on the circumstances of the fight. I'm dodging this one. Uh, but they were flying P-51s from Iwo Jima after they took the island, and they were providing escort for the B-29s. And the advantage was from Iwo Jima, they could go with the bombers all the way there and back, which the Hellcat could not. It was a shorter range carrier fighter.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the most important characteristics of the Mustang, which sort of especially changed the war over in the European theater, was its range. It could escort bombers all the way and back. But Nathan, where can people find and buy this book?
So it should be available at all your major retailers. It's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Walmart, and Target. All have it, and I think they also have the electronic versions for Kindle or whatever reader you have. And Audible has the spoken version. But thank you very much for the opportunity to tell you about it, and chat with you sort of about the history of the Moo. As you may have noticed, because I have a personal connection to the ship with my grandfather. I feel a real obligation not only to him, but all the families and the veterans that I've met as I've researched the story. So it's real important to me to sort of share it with the broader world, and I'm just grateful for the opportunity to do so.
That's amazing. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. It was a very enjoyable and interesting read. It gave me a lot of new insights and perspectives on the Pacific Theater that I'd never really heard of or thought before. So thank you for coming on the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me.